Welcome back. My name's Eli Schwartz, ready to guide you through the third installment of the Kaplan Way for learning. In this session, we'll learn how to apply the Kaplan Way. An excellent way to test for a deep level of understanding of a concept is to see whether someone can apply that concept in a novel scenario. So our objective for this training is to enable you to apply the Kaplan Way's categories in concrete, practical ways. Whether this will be directly within your working group or to raise students' scores more efficiently, or when implementing proven learning science principles. We'll be warming you up by asking what you already know about the topic at hand, after which we'll explain what the overall purpose of the checklist is and what happens to it when it's completed for each of the categories. We'll make sure you know what it's composed of, and at the end, you'll have a chance to see whether you can execute the learning objective, whether you can define and apply all of the categories. Before we begin in earnest, how do you now define learning? What experts would say is, learning is best defined as changing a person's actions and decisions. It's all about the learner and the goal of the learning we should be aiming towards. The teacher is there to guide the student to becoming more of an expert. There are 12 categories on the Kaplan Way checklist, each broken out into 3 subcategories, and each item receives either a 1 or 0, occasionally an A if it's impossible to rate because the course itself doesn't allow that category. The 2 overarching categories we saw in the very first training are objectives and assessment. Objectives have to give us a direction to knowing exactly what is being taught, and assessments should have a testable method to determine whether that learning objective has actually been satisfied. Within the user experience, usability is how well we can navigate throughout the course. Organization refers to the systematic complexity, going from easier content up through higher difficulty content, alternating practice and preparation. Personalization is the chance to tailor the course to what the student actually needs. Multimedia components may be visual, auditory, content driven through a video or a graphic that connect in some way to each other without being redundant. And motivation is maintaining a high level of confidence and positive correlation between effort put forward and eventual success. Within content development, we covered 5 additional categories. Overviews provide the weight or merit of a session up front so students know exactly what they're getting into. Information remains that focus on exactly what skill or content is being taught and avoids adding in nice-to-know information outside of the need-to-know we require. Examples should be worked examples that allow a student to understand and see illustrated how an expert would do the objectives. Practice is the opportunity to quiz the student and give pointed feedback to fix any potential errors before a final assessment. Integration is ensuring that there are opportunities for the student to fully apply to novel situations or have deep discussions of the content. Let's begin with the user experience categories that we learned in Part 2. As we go through each, you have one additional task to keep mind of. Try to associate a simple phrase or word that will allow you to remember each of the subcategories. Beginning with usability, what phrases come to mind? Hopefully, at the very least, that should be easy to use, that there are ways to assess the progress that has already taken place, and that there's a consistent and easy to observe style that remains functionally consistent throughout the user's interaction with that course or interface. Here's a nice example of student progress from a course in how to write effective multiple choice questions. Taking a look at the top left, when the student's mouse hovers over any of those buttons, a box will automatically pop up that shows the student how far she's gotten within that lesson. In addition, over the right-hand side, the 8 out of 14 shows the student a quick snapshot of where she currently is, but with a click, that box will automatically pop up and show her how many she's completed thus far with pleasant and satisfying check marks, and then the ones that have not yet been completed. For consistent style and ease of use, it's notable to mention that this unit is one of 4 in a training track that uses the same platform and style for each of them. And of course, there's a green bar at the bottom of our training telling you how far along you've come so far, and will continue to do so. Our next category pertinent to the user experience is organization, or learning events' internal logic. Remember, a lesson shouldn't be a hodgepodge of topics and learning objectives arbitrarily tossed together. There should be alignment between the learning objectives and the content. And the course developer should present the prerequisites in the most effective order. Scaffolding. That's a verb you'll hear a lot in learning science. We want to scaffold and ensure that each new skill or topic builds on the ones before. And certainly, the teacher or lesson should alternate between presenting information about a skill and letting the students practice that skill. Student engagement, not to mention learning events themselves, hinge on a learner having lots of chances to take the reins and try things out. Here's a sample from a Kaplan University course designed to prepare those who want to enter the legal profession as court reporters and bailiffs and the like. Note the movement from definitions of types of acts currently on screen to a precedent involving those definitions, to the student practice that they're supposed to engage in. This is a course that starts with definitions and real-world examples, and then applies to relevant terms, and then challenges the students to think about it all and draw their own conclusions. Personalization is probably the least well understood of the 12 categories, but it doesn't mean that the student has free rein to wander around and do what she likes. Remember, this means that the course itself analyzes the student and directs them what to do and what not to do based on performance. When we find what a learner already knows, that valuable evidence and information tells us what content areas potentially could be dropped or adapted, how many of what types of examples or assignments should be given. And remember, someone new to the task, as judged by a diagnostic or other pretest, would still have to follow the pre-said pathway and potentially the entirety of the designed course. But someone who shows some expertise should be allowed to skip certain lessons or move ahead faster than others. The whole world is excited about the ways in which designers and engineers can harness technology to treat every student as something special, but additionally to maintain that efficient, effective education level. This is a report to a teacher in a K-12 course, putting personalization in the teacher's hands. It presents performance data as to what the majority of the class most needs to revisit, and it identifies different students by immediate situation and immediate need. One size definitely doesn't fit all, but the different approaches, meaning that we can have targeted recommendations. Now, multimedia can certainly enhance a presentation and make it more effective or engaging. What we don't want to do is just confront text, but rather engage our eyes and ears as well. We want to make sure, though, that it doesn't detract badly from the hoped-for learning events and instruction. The goal is to make every bit of multimedia clear, engaging, and never overwhelming. In an ideal world, the learner would have the option to read or listen or watch a video, whatever she prefers, and her lessons would be sliced and diced into their step-by-step components, allowing her to always choose the piece of multimedia best suited. This example from a nursing video is a segment providing additional detail to similar but different information in the content book and classroom lesson. We won't play the clip right now, but suffice it to say, the instructor does not merely read off the text we're seeing here on screen, but adds substantial weight and expertise on top of it. Motivation has to do with getting the students fired up to get started, but also make sure they have enough fire to keep going. The checklist really cuts past a lot of theory to be very specific about how motivational tactics should be used. We admit when a topic is really hard. Knowledge about difficulty level, studies say, influences learners' willingness to invest that additional time. Also, we never let the student think that success hinges on anything other than two things: their effort and their attitude. Those who believe us, who ascribe performance to effort, are much more likely to re-engage after a bad practice session and continue putting in the effort to see the final payoff. There are two slides we'll show here from an LSAT channel episode taking some of the terror out of the test by exposing prevalent but incorrect myths. This first slide encourages students to not get discouraged when, not if, she gets stuff wrong. Everyone does, and rising above today's disappointing performance is crucial to getting ready for tomorrow's performance. The second slide reminds LSAT preppers that taking the red pill, with a hat tip to the matrix, and choosing to go down the LSAT rabbit hole is never easy. No one ever finds the LSAT a walk in the park, but it can be made more manageable if we prep for it, not as an obstacle placed in our way. Now, let's jump in with the 5 categories that content developers must be guided by. As we go through these, remember, you have an additional task. Try to associate a common example or phrase with each of the subcategories as we review the 5 main categories. The overview both introduces and comments at the start of courses and units and lessons. At the beginning of a course, you want a preview of what's coming, but you also want the lesson's goals clarified, and you need to know the worth of what you're about to learn. Studies suggest that students are most motivated to start, continue, and complete their efforts when they are fully convinced of the value of what they're doing, and the content is clearly scaffolded for them. Here's an overview from the opening unit in a Kaplan University course on the ethics in the financial sector. If you take the time to read it, you'll see that it does all the things I just mentioned. It sets the stage for what's coming, explains why the content is important, and, as you see at the very bottom, ties the learning objectives of the unit to the unit's content. Falling under the category of information would be things like a teacher's lecture or handouts and background reading. The stuff the student needs. Remember, we need to maintain alignment with the course's learning objectives. And critically, but often ignored, is that everyone is involved, particularly teachers, in banishing from the classroom or video anything that doesn't further the learning objective. A teacher can, with the best of intentions, go off on all sorts of interesting tangents that are unrelated to the learning objective. But even though the intentions may be good, the effect can actually be damaging. If the goal is to make a student more capable at a specific thing, anything not needed for that thing should ideally be avoided altogether. Need to know must prevail for the student's sake. This page from the MCAT Teacher's Edition intends to teach the instructor how to deliver this subject matter. In that spirit, notice that the sheer phrase, big questions, highlights the most important concepts and sends clear signals as to what the student needs to know. The page has other virtues too. It's well organized, it's quite usable, it's presenting key information in a way that makes the learner more of an expert. Speaking of examples, we mean that when the teacher presents something, that they're illustrating the skills being taught in the learning event. When a teacher is introducing a content area, she should put examples onto the board that directly illustrate that content. Not just any old examples, but ones that relate directly to the skills that are maintained within that learning objective. She'll stay within that focused scope. Worked examples are very big in education in general and at Kaplan today. They bring the student right inside the brain of the expert. Let's take a look at one. Here's a true worked example in its purest form. Each step on the left is addressed by the expert on the right. In the class, the student would be asked to discuss why the expert knows, for instance, to seek out two values for x, or why he knows that both must be negative, and so on down the line. And then, ideally, the student would get another example in the self-same form to try on her own. Think about the effect here. We've taken the student through a step-by-step example of a problem, then she gets a chance to execute the same steps on another similar problem, having become familiar with how an expert thinks. Now she can apply the exact same process herself. We said that a good lesson alternates between the teacher presenting and the student doing. The real purpose of practice is so that the student, or teacher, or smart reports, or whoever, can figure out what the student is doing wrong and correct it. Note, practice is never any good unless one gets feedback on it to make those corrections. This explanation, for example, works a lot like a worked example. Writing in chatty, informal style, the explainer shows how an expert would approach this question at the outset, takes us into his head, doesn't reveal the right answer until he comes up with it throughout the course of dialogue, and sure, he'll touch on the other wrong choices, but briefly, the real work's already been done, and he'll always leave the student with a takeaway for future work. Course developers take special pains to make connections between lessons and quizzes and homework and lectures. At the same time, we want students to think deeply into the topics we present. For instance, I've made references to your further thinking about these 12 categories within your work group or going forward on other projects. Forging connections among the various course components and encouraging deeper thinking among the learners are what the integration category is all about. Here are two examples taken from the tail end of a Kaplan University microeconomics course. Once students have command of the course's concepts and skills, they're asked to think deeply about brand new situations the course has never brought up before. This first one is Ethiopian poverty and famine, and the question guides the students' research and asks the students to bring some opinions and analysis to bear. This later one talks about the economic impact of legalizing marijuana. As far as integration, we're carefully noticing what has been studied is only valuable if it can actually be applied. As we go through the following examples, your goal is to find out which category is being illustrated, and within the scenario, is this being illustrated in a positive fashion or to a detriment? In this example, John is receiving congratulatory, motivating emails. Excellent. This is positive motivation. In this example, it appears that Marie has a high level of proficiency or expertise in biology. However, her syllabus did not adapt or personalize the content to her. Instead, she's watching remedial 15-minute sessions when she could otherwise be working on something more to her speed. In this example, Marianne can clearly see how far she's come in that particular lesson because she knows to always check the same clearly indicated corner of her screen. The key here is that this 15-minute lecture seems to not have been well scaffolded into the lesson. That's clearly detrimental organization of the course overall. The problem with our example here is that while it might seem that clicking on a very clearly labeled link would be high usability, in fact it doesn't let the user clearly and simply get to the point they need to be at. In fact, she ends up right back where she started. It sounds like Sam has clearly been given a fundamental session to begin with, to work his way up to a higher difficulty, more expert session. That's good scaffolding and good organization. Similarly, Charles has had his content personalized based off of his impressive results. That means he shouldn't have to do the same course content that a novice does. Instead, he can move on to something adaptably more expert. Unfortunately, this would be a pretty dry video to watch. There's a potential for cognitive dissonance when the student is reading text on screen at a different pace than the instructor is, and additionally, the audio overlay isn't adding anything new to the content already visible in the video. It sounds like Alice has a pretty great book. Each chapter beginning with a paragraph explaining use is an excellent use of overview. Unfortunately, canceling this session leaves the students without a wonderful opportunity for higher level integration. The ability to discuss with peers and potentially make new lasting connections is now gone. It sounds like Cindy is adding in additional information above and beyond the actual concrete focus or learning objective. If it's about the history of a historical location, then recent trip photos are nice to know, but not need to know. Those students should be happy for the opportunity to take that short quiz and, specific to practice, receive pointed feedback on how to review and fix any potential problems among that set. This sounds like Max is doing a great service for his students, not just giving a nice detailed subtopic overview, but additionally, hopefully, letting them know exactly why they should be excited and pay attention for each of those subtopics. Oh dear, James, giving a memorization recommendation instead of an example, or hopefully a worked example, is depriving Katie of the opportunity to really see how an expert works through content. Now that's the way to do it, John. Dropping that excess tangent and extraneous information allows us to get through, focused on learning objectives, and providing that efficient, effective learning event that the student came for. Unfortunately, the layout of this textbook sounds like it doesn't allow the student to test themselves as they go, alternating, as all good practice should, between content introduction and self-test and review. At this point, this session has culminated the Kaplan Way for learning. We hope that you have a solid grasp on the applications of the user experience categories, as well as the applications for content development categories. If there are any further questions or you'd like to have us provide feedback on projects you're involved with, please reach out to us directly.